All right, everyone. Welcome to our spooky embroidery stitch along. I am super excited to get this stitch along started. It's going to be a little bit of an experiment or work in progress since this is our first embroidery stitch along. So I'll be learning right alongside of you as far as what works for this and what doesn't work so well for this. If you have any thoughts or feedback, of course, we'd love to hear it for the next one because there are plans for future stitch along. So we definitely want all the feedback about your experience with it and all that good stuff. My goal for this first stitch along is to kind of be super beginner friendly, kind of describing things, taking it slow, going over the prep, and then going over the stitches each week. That being said, one of my favorite things about embroidery stitch-alongs is that there's a lot of freedom that comes with them. So if you want to take it in a different direction as far as stitches and colors go, you already have a handle on what you want to do in your vision, please make it your own. I would love to see it. So that being said, let's go ahead and just get started with some of the basics. First, let's talk about hoops. So here's one kind of hoop. This one's a little bit different. We'll go over that in a second. Most hoops look kind of like this. They have a screw on top that you can twist to loosen or to tighten. I think it's righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, just the same as most everything in life. And then this slips out. You can put your fabric in between it and then screw to tighten. When it comes to putting your fabric inside for embroidery, you do want to make sure that your fabric is in there nice and tight. So let's see if I can do it real fast for you. When it comes to getting my fabric, I do not wash my fabric usually before I get it, unless it is from like a craft store, because I get scraps from the craft store. So it's like, if it's scraps from the craft store, then I'll wash it just because other people have been handling it. But if it's not from the craft store, like this piece here is from, I think, Fernway Studios. Fernway Studio on Etsy. Excuse me. I don't wash that. I'll just use it as is. Mostly because I guess I trust the Etsy sellers. And I usually just wash it afterwards once I'm done stitching with it. So there it is inside my hoop. Some people prefer to stitch on top like this. Others prefer like this. Sometimes I'm working with a small hoop like this or a 3-inch hoop. I'll actually stitch on the inside just because it keeps my fingers off of the edges and kind of just keeps the oils from getting there. But it's totally up to you and your preference. So to tighten, you'll just screw this in, put it against your body, and hold it as you screw. And then once it kind of feels like it's on kind of tight, you'll take your fabric and pull going along the edges, making sure that it's nice and tight. So just pull all the way around like that, and then go and tighten it again. Tight, and then same thing, go all the way around, pulling on the edges so the fabric is like uniformly tightened, I guess be a good way to say or describe it. Alright, and the goal is to get your fabric on there tight enough that it kind of sounds like a drum. So that's kind of a quick how to hoop your fabric. Hopefully that helps someone. And then let's talk about the floss real quick. So this right here is the 310 DMC black color. So here's my hair. To separate the floss the way that I like to do it, I think there are other methods, but this is my method, or the method that I like the best, is that you take all 6 strands and you pull out one at a time. So I separate one strand, I hold that loosely and kind of pinch the others between my 2 fingers and kind of just pull it away. And it should just come apart smooth like butter. And then I could do it again for however many strands I want to use and separate it. So not only does this allow you to use a certain number of strands, by separating the strands and then putting them together, I've heard, and I'm pretty sure it's true, but the internet has told me that it helps your floss lie flatter when you stitch with it. So when you are doing stitches on your piece, it helps not have any twists and things like that as you stitch. So that's kind of why to separate your strands. So this is 3 strands here. That's actually what we're going to stitch with to start with this piece today. There are a couple different ways to thread your needle. Oh, also I've had lots of questions about what kind of needles to use for embroidery. I just bought a pack of DMC needles when I first started embroidery, and it just came in a pack like this with like various sizes, and I have just kind of picked whatever needle I thought worked best for the piece as I went. I don't think any of these are tapestry needles. I think tapestry needles aren't as sharp, or like they're blunter, which is what most cross stitchers use maybe, but I'm not completely sure about that. Don't quote me. But anyway, so I just kind of choose, like if I'm working on like a really detailed piece, I'll use like the really tiny ones like this. If I'm working with a larger piece or something that uses more strands, I'll use like a bigger needle with a bigger eye. So that's kind of what I've used. So anyway, let's talk about threading. You can lick your thread, which is totally fine. That's the way my grandma taught me to do it, and that's totally the way I do it. Sometimes, although in the midst of our current conditions, I've tried to step away from that, especially for gifts for people, and done like water, like a cup of water by my stitching, and I'll like dip my fingers in there and then put it on the thread. Another way that I've just kind of learned about the last couple weeks, and I've been trying to use more, although it doesn't always work for me, depending on how many strands I'm using. We'll see if it works now, is you kind of just like put the floss between your fingers, and kind of just like pinch them together. Then you take the eye of your needle and put it over where you know the floss is, and you kind of like shimmy or push it down as you like push, oh look, it did it, push the floss through, and you're good. And a lot of people swear by that and say it's totally foolproof. I think it's just me that struggles with it, so try it, see if it works for you. As far as knotting, or how to start or end your first piece of thread, I guess, I just knot it at the end. Usually it's super simple. Some other people do like the loop start, which I've done a couple times. Some people just kind of, they'll start like a stitch off to the side and then bring it over and like bury their stitch around it to secure it and things like that, and I've done that before as well, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to knot it. So I just tied a knot, shimmy it towards the end, and I'm just going to use that. Okay, so that's kind of how to get started with how to hoop your fabric, separating your floss, putting on your needle. Let's talk about what kind of stitches we're going to be using today. So we're going to start with back stitch, which I think is kind of probably everyone's first starter stitch. It was mine anyway. I don't know. It seems like it's in most kits. So back stitch, I'll show you how to do it in a second, but here on my hoop, I already have 2 strands, 4 strands, and 6 strands, kind of show you the difference of like thickness for all of those. So you can see how the 2 strands and the 6 strands especially are different. So that way you know when you start your piece, what you might want to use. I'm going to use 3 strands today. You can use 2, 4, 6, whatever your preference is totally fine. So I have a line drawn, not a very straight line, but I have a line anyway, drawn here on my hoop to show you back stitch first. So what I'm going to do is bring my needle up through the ends of my line, and then I'm going to put it back down on my line. And then trying my best to keep the same size stitch coming back up through my fabric. Just going to eyeball it. It doesn't have to be super precise, but you do want to try your best to keep the same size stitch. I'm going to bring my needle back up through my fabric. And then I'm going to find the same hole that I originally went down in, it's right there, and put my needle back down through that. So I'm backing up into my first stitch, which is why it's called back stitch. Eureka moment. So then I'm going to do the same thing, trying my best to keep a uniform stitch size, come back up through my fabric, and back down through the same hole. Like that. And I would just keep doing that all the way towards the end of this line. The great thing about using a dark color like this one, or like a dark blue or green or anything like that, any of the darker colors, is that your stitches blend together really well. So when it comes to like the uniformity of the stitches, you don't really see too much of the difference, even if there is one. If you're using a lighter color floss for this, you might see the difference between your stitch sizes if there is a big difference between them. So again, just going up and then coming back down through the same hole. Oops. There we go. Knot it up a bit. With back stitch, your needle doesn't twist too much with this one, like some other stitches, but if you notice that your thread is tangling a lot, or you see like when you look at your floss that it's twisting, you can just let's see if I can do it, just let your needle kind of dangle and it'll naturally untwist itself, and then you can continue on with your stitch. So that is back stitch. Let me know if there's any questions, or if you have any questions, of course, just ask in the group, and I'm sure lots of stitching enthusiasts will help you out. So that's back stitch. Then the other kind of stitch we're going to use for this first part is satin stitch, which is a little trickier, but again, they're a popular stitch. Oh, actually, let's show off how to stop stitch. So turning my piece over, here you can see the back, turning my piece over, there's a couple of different ways you can end a stitch. I am definitely not an expert stitcher by any stretch of the imagination. If I were to like rate myself on like comfortability, I guess, with stitching, I would say I'm like intermediate maybe. Or I just like obsessively stalk a lot of Facebook groups. So I'm still definitely learning. So things I say might not be right, but these are things that have kind of worked for me. You can either just take your floss and knot it off at the end, kind of like scooting your knot down towards the fabric, and then tightening it to secure the knot, and then just cutting off the floss above wherever your knot is. Another thing that I sometimes do is I'll put my stitches back, kind of like weaving them a little bit back under my last few stitches, and kind of knot it that way, if that makes sense, to secure it. And I find that has worked really well for me. And then I'll just, oops, that wasn't good, cut it there. So a couple different things you can do. As long as it's secure, or you feel like it's secure, it's probably fine. The only time I'm like especially paranoid about how I finish my stitch is like if I'm stitching on a jacket or a shirt or something like that, where like people are gonna wear it, and I definitely don't want the stitches coming out. But for display pieces, I generally don't worry too much about it. So there's that. Let's talk about satin stitch a little bit. So satin stitch, I've drawn we'll call it a circle here to kind of show that off. So a lot of people like to outline, oh, there are my dogs. Sorry. A lot of people like to outline their stitch with back stitch first before they fill it in with satin stitch. And that kind of helps you get a feel for the shape, and help keep your satin stitches, help them fill, I guess. I don't really know. You don't have to outline it in back stitch if you don't want to. It's totally fine. Sometimes I do not. So what you would do is just follow again the line of the circle around doing your back stitch, keeping them as uniform as you can. But if they're not completely uniform, I mean, don't stress out about it. It's totally fine. Unstitching is totally a thing. You can definitely just take your stitch, unthread your needle, yeah, and then just pull the floss back up, or you can leave it and it'll work out just fine. You can not stress about it. So whatever you decide is totally up to you. Sometimes I think it's just best to have like a Bob Rossian attitude about it. Just think of all the happy little trees There are no accidents. Everyone's mountains are going to look different, and that's fine. It's all just practice. And again, if you're already comfortable with backstitch and with satin stitch, feel free to like skip ahead for when the pattern or my piece is out in front of me, and I'll describe what we're stitching. I'm just trying to, my goal again is to kind of just make this approachable for people. This is a little wonky, isn't it? Stitching without a stand. It's fun. So the best, another like little tip or trickaroo is when it comes to following circles or like organic shapes, the smaller your stitches is, the smaller your stitches are, the easier it is to follow that line or that organic line or shape, like a circle or flower or leaf, things like that. Oh, and I've knotted in the back. Sometimes knots happen, and you can either leave them or struggle with them. I might just leave this one for the sake of the video. Oh, look. Sometimes you just tug and it comes right out. Not all the time, but sometimes. And that's nice. Okay, so I'm going to call that good just because I don't want to keep you guys on here too long. But we'll just say finish the circle. And then what you would do for satin stitch is you would come up just outside of your back stitch. There are the dogs again. And then if there was a back stitch on this side, I'd put it down just on the other side of that as well to cover the back stitch. And then when it comes to satin stitch and you see that your thread isn't lining up perfectly or it has a little twist, fix that now, because it is hard to go back and fix that later on. So now I'm going to put this stitch back up through the fabric as close as I can kind of get it without coming up through the same hole as my first stitch, and then put it down as close as I can to it. And then I'll keep doing that to fill in. Oh, I forgot to mention, with satin stitch, I find that it's easier to start in the middle of the shape as opposed to like the edge of the shape. I think it's just easier to kind of follow the line and get a feel for like the gradual change of the shape. But if you like starting from the edge, or that makes more sense to you, do it. Do it. That's totally fine. But I find that the middle is easier. Sometimes what I'll also do if I'm like stitching a flower or a leaf, something I'll do to like help me visualize what direction my stitches will need to be, especially if it's like a shape that like is like a cone or like changes direction or not changes direction, but like tapers. I'll put lines like this on my piece that'll kind of help keep my satin stitches where I want them to go. And if you find that because whatever you're stitching does taper and you're running out of room, like you have a lot of room to fill up here and not a lot of room down here, feel free to use the same hole. You can totally do that. You can bring it up through like the top where you have all that space, and then put it back down through the same hole. Like if I wanted to do that here, I could totally do that. And that's fine. It'll still look like satin stitch. So feel free to do that. And once you've filled your shape, you'll step back and you'll kind of look at it and see if there are any gaps that you can see through your satin stitch, like that. It's kind of like a gap right there. So once I'm done with this circle, I'd probably go back up and just put another stitch right between those two, just to cover that space. And that's something that you can fix later once you're done filling the shape. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so that's satin stitch, just following the line, following the curve. See, like that's another gap right there. And sometimes things that look like they're gaps, like I thought that was going to be a gap, but when I put that next stitch down beside it, it kind of pushed it over, so I don't know, it's less of a gap now. Doesn't bother me quite as much. So yeah. So I think I'm going to call that good for this and call that satin stitch, kind of giving you guys an idea of what we're doing. Okay, so that's a quick tutorial on satin stitch and back stitch, which is what we're going to be using today. And actually, let me bring up my project now. So I actually, confession, I actually started filming this yesterday, and then I lost all the video that I had done yesterday, so I had to start over today. So that's why some of this is already done, which is a bummer, but it's actually fine because my current aesthetic for filming seems to be chaotic crafter, so it's probably better for the best that I get round 2 at this to show you instead of round 1, which again was chaotic at best. So as you can see, what we're going to be stitching this first for the week number 1 is our mushrooms at the bottom of the fabric, or the bottom of the pattern, excuse me. So I'm going to be doing back stitch to outline all of the mushroom first. Excuse me. And then I'm going to fill the mushroom caps with a satin stitch. Again, just a quick reminder, if you were wanting to use a different stitch or even a different color for this, you totally can do that. That's one of the beautiful things about embroidery and embroidery stitch-alongs, is that if you have a different vision for this, please do. Sometimes when I've done other stitch-alongs, I've like looked at the pattern and been like, oh, well, that's obviously satin stitch, and that's obviously back stitch, and that's obviously French knots and all this, and then like people will be showing their progress as they've stitched things, and you're like, and they've used a different stitch or a different color, and you're like, oh my god, like that's amazing and genius, like how did you even think of that or like come up with that? It's crazy how some people's minds work. So again, if your mind is working differently than mine, go ahead and use a different stitch or a different color. I think like a stem stitch would look really well for outlining the mushrooms, and maybe like a long short would also work well with the caps, but it's totally up to you. Again, since we are stitching kind of an organic shape, like how it curves, I'm going to use kind of a smaller back stitch. And I'm stitching on, I think it's Kona cotton for this one, which is one of like my preferences when it comes to fabric for embroidery. When I go to the craft stores and pick out the scraps, if I see Kona cotton, I like grab it no matter what kind of pattern or color it is. I just like it. I think I read like on a blog that when I first started that Kona cotton was something to look for. I don't really know how true that is or not, but I like it. I just like 100% cotton too, just natural fibers a lot. But again, with embroidery, you can stitch on anything, which is what makes it so awesome. Like, I haven't tried stitching on felt yet, but I absolutely love every piece I see that uses felt. So I hope that's in my future sometime. But so yeah, you can use anything: linen, cotton blends, denim, whatever your heart desires, you can use. There we go. So one thing I am going to do a little differently when it comes to this is I'm also going to do what's called a whipped back stitch. Whipped. Anyone else watch Family Guy? I always think of that. I don't even know what episode it's from. But when like Stewie says whipped, how he says it like a certain way, and Brian's like, what did you just say? And he says whipped cream or something like that, and it just cracks me up every time. Anyway, that's what pops into my brain anytime I say whipped or think of whipped back stitch. I think of Stewie. But that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to do whipped stitch, a whipped back stitch. And what that is it's just a way to, I guess, for lack of a better vocabulary about it, is to blend your back stitch. So you can kind of see I've already whipped this side, and this is that back stitch that I just did. And you can kind of tell a difference. I mean, one side is a little thicker. Let's see if I can move my phone a little bit for you. Perfect. But you can kind of see how, I don't know, you can kind of see like, I feel like the valleys, peaks and valleys in my stitch that way. kind of where the needle's pointing at. And here, by whipping it, it kind of took away that peak and valley effect. It just made it like a solid line. So what you'll do is you're going to stitch all the way around these mushrooms, outlining, outlining, outlining. Then we'll fill it with satin. But since I'm down here, I just kind of want to show you the whipped back stitch. So for whipped back stitch, what you're going to do is you're going to bring, try that again. You're going to bring your needle up from where you first started your back stitch. And what you're going to do is you're going to weave your needle and floss under every stitch, which is, I guess, the whip part. I don't really know where whip came from, but you're just going to go one direction. You're not going to zigzag around. You're just going to go one direction when it comes to this. So this is my first stitch. I'm going to put my needle under it and push under. It does get a little annoying to do. Like if you have stitches here, you don't want to catch them, so let's be careful when you do that. And you can do it either way. Like you could have started and gone this way, which looking back is probably the smarter decision. So that way you don't catch this. So actually, let's see if I can undo what I just did. And if not, I'll just keep going and you can, there we go. Okay. So let me pick this out real quick so I can go the other way, because I think the other way will be better, especially for you guys that are following along. So again, in a perfect world, I would have already had back stitched everything, filled it in, all that jazz. But I just want to kind of get this done, not make you, oh goodness, no, I can't thread my needle. Come on, come on, everybody. All right, let's see. Okay, there it is. Got my needle back. Okay, so I'm going to put it this way, so that way if I had stitches going up this side, I'm not going to catch them with my needle. Take my needle back on this side, go back under my next stitch. Again, I've used 3 strands for this, and that's what I'm going to use for the entirety of the mushroom, is 3 strands. Just going back to the other side, going under my next stitch. And if you miss a stitch whipping it, you can do what I did and just take your floss back out, or you can just leave it, and that's also totally fine. I have definitely stitched smaller pieces where it was like impossible to really see every single back stitch that I did, so I kind of just guessed, and it worked out fine. I think your eye just naturally blends everything together when it comes to this, and again, using the dark color, you kind of get a little more grace when it comes to stitching like that, and your eye just naturally blends everything together, so it doesn't really matter. But if you know in your heart of hearts that it's going to drive you up the wall, then by all means unstitch and redo. I apologize for my hands. I try my best. I drink lots of water, I promise. As I've always had these hands. I was born with it. It's not Maybelline. Okay, so I'm almost to the end of this. I wanted to get to the end so that way I can show you how to finish it. Super simple. You're gonna be like, oh my god, that's so simple. Like, yeah, told you it was simple. Okay. Oh, just go back down, kind of where your last stitch ends, and boom, it's a whipped. It's whipped. There we go. I hope you can see that. So it's now whipped. So you can kind of see a difference, how it's just like a line now. And I just like how it blends. If you like the look of back stitch, then by all means, do not whip it. It's just an option. Okay. So now when it comes to satin stitch, zoom out. Up here, I have outlined some of the mushroom and started to fill it. And I'm just, again, using the 3 strands coming up on one side of the back stitch, working from the middle out, coming back down as close as I can to that back stitch line, and then continuing the same way all the way down the shape. trying to stay as close as I can from my last stitch, but again, if you like find yourself with a space after you've done your satin stitch, you can always go back and fill it in. Just try your best to keep an eye more on the floss twisting, because that is harder to fix. I've like tried combing out my floss before, like once it's already been stitched down in satin stitch, and that's kind of helped, but kind of just is what it is, I think, after a certain point. So that's satin stitch. And you can kind of see here on my mushroom lines, I'm just going to use the same back stitch. Show you another one here. As far as that goes, to do those little lines that are in the detail of the mushroom. Okay, excuse me, I was trying to zoom and I like messed with the, what's that called? Contrast? White? I don't know. Exposure. Okay, so that's kind of the mushroom. One thing I did want to point out, let me grab my printout of the pattern, is that on the mushrooms there are like these little lines on the mushrooms, and for those little lines there, my needle, these little lines, I'm going to use, I think, one strand to do those, just so that they look like they're more detailed compared to like the thick outline. Like I want it to look like delicate mushroom wrinkles. So I'm going to use a small back stitch. I'm not going to whip it. I'm just going to use a small back stitch of a single strand for those. And then the rest of it is 3 strands. So 3 strands for the satin stitch, 3 strands for the back stitch, and taking those same 3 strands and whipping it if you decide to do that. And then the only time I'm changing it is right here for these, which is a single. You could probably also do a 2 strands, and that would also work, just for comparison. Here is that hoop that we were looking at earlier. So that's 2 strands right there. And we used 3 strands for the mushroom. So that kind of gives you an idea of what it'll look like for the line work. Let's see, I think that is it for this stitch along. I'll leave also instructions in the comments or in the post itself, of course, how to do this in case this video becomes too much for you. Also, a heads up, in the post, it also talks about a podcast to listen to. I thought it'd be kind of fun to do like a listen and stitch as kind of just something, a fun twist to do for us for this, especially since Halloween. There's so many fun, creepy podcasts out there. So I've linked a couple of podcasts as well. Hopefully you can access them. Lore is a super, super popular podcast, but it's really, really fun. It is creepy. I listened to it yesterday and I had to end up calling my dogs back up the stairs to listen with me because I was creeping myself out. The other one is kind of more of a factually based, I know it's supernatural so it's not really factual, but factually like research based one, and it's pretty fun to listen to as well. I tried to keep things like trigger-ish friendly, if you know what I mean. Like I didn't want to use like any true crime stuff just because I know everyone's a little different when it comes to that. So this one is truly more of a supernatural thing. But if you're sensitive to supernatural stuff, then do not listen to it. Please read the descriptions and decide if it's right for you to listen or to skip and to just stitch. But anyway, that's all we have for this week. Next week, we'll continue on to a new piece. I can't wait to see what kind of stitches everyone decides to use and what kind of colors. I hope this was helpful. Let me know.